So we saw then how when Jesus started his ministry, he was incredibly popular. Lots and lots of people followed him from all over the country. He's very, very popular. And we can see how popular he was by quite a few of the incidents that were recorded in the Gospels. So this is one when he was doing a miracle, when the people saw the sign, feeding the 5,000, which he'd done. It's a miracle. They said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Seeing that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew. So the people were so impressed by what he taught and what he was doing, they felt, this is a prophet sent by God. We want to make him our king. There was so much they wanted him to become the king of Israel. But Jesus withdrew. He didn't want to get involved in that sort of thing. Okay? So you have to think, well, why not? What's going on here? So one day, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter, who is his number one disciple, said, "You are the Messiah." Yeah, you're the Messiah, which is, as it looked at, anointed, the king. So Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So Jesus told his disciples, don't tell anybody that I am the Messiah. Don't tell anybody what you think about me. So why did Jesus tell his disciples not to go around saying he was a Messiah? Interesting. Why did he do this? Well, in order to do this, you have to understand what is a Messiah. What is the Messianic mission? So this is a traditional Jewish understanding of the Messiah. The Messiah is God's anointed one. That's what the word Messiah means, chosen one. He's called God's son. He's also, his role is to bring blessings from God, bring God's blessing, God's presence into the world. He also comes to establish God's kingdom on the earth, but also to destroy Israel's enemies, to defeat Israel's enemies and protect Israel, and also ultimately to rule the whole world. So the Romans, they've been occupying Israel for quite a long time. They understood what the word Messiah meant. They'd already executed quite a few people that we looked at yesterday, I think. No, Wednesday. We saw how the Romans had executed quite a few people who claimed to be the Messiah, who were proclaimed as the Messiah. So Jesus realized and knew, if the Romans hear that I am the Messiah, or people are calling me the Messiah, then the Romans are going to execute me. And he didn't want that to happen. So that's why he told his disciples, don't tell anybody I'm the Messiah. And again, if you look at Father's autobiography, you can see that when there were lots of women students from the women's university came to study, Father told them, go back to university and study, but don't cause a disruption. Don't disturb the lectures. Don't go around telling people I'm the Messiah or anything like that. But the reality is they went back to your university and they caused a huge problems because they went around disturbing the lessons and telling people that Father's Messiah. As a result of that, they were expelled, and also 5 professors were expelled as well. And it's from that moment that all the opposition to Father started. Yeah, because there was a Christian university, and the Christian university, the head of the university was afraid that if the American sponsors who give money find out that a lot of the students and professors are following some young moon who is a new Messiah, then they'll lose their funding. So the head of the university said, we can't do that, allow this to carry on, or the American sponsors, the Methodist Church will find out, we'll lose our funding. So she kicked them all out. And that's from that moment, that's when the persecution of Father started. The Father understood that as well. He was doing exactly what Jesus said. And unfortunately, Jesus' disciples who went around telling people he's the Messiah, just as a lot of these students went around proclaiming Father's Messiah, and it brought all kinds of problems. So Jesus got into struggles with some of the religious leaders. He was very critical of some of them, some of the things that they were doing. You might wonder, who are these people? Pharisees, scribes. So the Jewish people then, they were divided into different groups, quite a few different religious groups. It's not a unified religion, always been different groups. So one group 2,000 years ago, they were called the Sadducees. They were the ruling class, aristocratic priestly group. So it's from this group of people that all the priests came, and the high priest. And so they were rich. And so when the Romans occupied Israel, they had a choice. They could either revolt against the Roman occupation, in which case they would be wiped out and they'd lose all their property and social status, or they could decide to collaborate. And so what they did is they collaborated with the Roman occupation to try to be sort of mediators between the Romans and the rest of the Jewish people. It's another group, they were called, so the Sadducees then, they mostly lived in Jerusalem and their focal point was the temple. Another group we call the Pharisees. They're very, very popular amongst ordinary people. They're quite democratically organized. The focus of their activities was the synagogue because they're mostly into teaching and providing spiritual guidance and teaching. Another group were called the Essenes. So they were a breakaway group of priests. They were so disgusted by the corruption in the temple in Jerusalem that this group, they left Jerusalem and they went down to the Dead Sea and they started their own spiritual community there. Another group were called the Zealots. They were nationalist freedom fighters, so they fought against the Romans and would attack Romans whenever they could. So each of these are different responses to occupation. So it's really difficult. If your country is occupied by a foreign power, you have to decide, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond to this occupation? And each of these groups had to decide how they're going to respond. So as I said, the Sadducees, they decided to collaborate. The Pharisees, they objected to the Roman occupation, but they weren't going to fight against the Romans violently. So they focused their activities upon teaching and education. The Essenes just thought, we're just going to go away and separate ourselves from everybody. And the Zealots decided to take up arms to fight against the Romans. So that was very, very intense. Anyway, so Jesus then, this is towards the end of his life, after his 3 years of ministry. So Jesus then, he decides to go to Jerusalem. He feels he's got a lot of support, and he goes into Jerusalem for the Passover. And as he goes in with all his disciples and with thousands and thousands of followers and supporters. And he goes in sitting on, according to the Bible, he sits on a donkey or an ass, and he goes in, and then people throw down palms. That's why it's called Palm Sunday. They throw down palm leaves in front of his way. And as he goes in, the crowds proclaim, Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. That's really serious. The crowds of his followers, they're proclaiming he's the King of Israel. And so this gets back to the Jewish leaders and the political authorities. Because standing on the gate of the city, there'd be Roman soldiers and policemen. And they would hear, oh, someone has just entered the city who's been with thousands of followers, and they're proclaiming that he's the King of Israel. And so this went back to the Jewish leaders and political authorities. And the Jewish leaders, the high priests and the priests, they said, look, how the whole world has gone after him. So they said to themselves, Jesus has been accepted by the whole world. In other words, lots and lots of people accepted him and were following him. And not just ordinary people, common people, as it says in the Bible, yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him. So Jesus had many, many supporters and followers and disciples. There were ordinary people, but also many that were leaders as well. So if we look at some of these religious leaders, this is one of them here. He's called Joseph of Arimathea. He was probably Jesus' uncle. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. So that's the ruling council, the ruling body of the Jewish people. So it's like being a member of parliament or a member of the synod in the Church of England. And also a very rich man, a very rich person. There's another one called Nicodemus. He was also a member of the Sanhedrin, again, like a member of parliament or the religious leader. And he was also a Pharisee. one of the leading Pharisees. Another one was Gamaliel. So he was the leader of the Pharisees, and he's thought to have been a secret supporter of Jesus, because after the crucifixion, when some of Jesus' disciples were brought before the Sanhedrin to be tried, he said you should let them go, because if they're from God, then you shouldn't try and prevent them from acting. There's another one called Jairus. So these are all figures whose names are mentioned in the New Testament as following and supporting Jesus, the early church. Another one was called Jairus, who was a leader of the synagogue. So these are just the ones mentioned in the New Testament and the Gospels, so probably many others as well. So what effect did this have then? So you can see here, if you remember from yesterday, this is the Jewish temple, the court. This is the place behind here where they do the worshipping and give the sacrifices. This is their Roman fortress, the Antonine fortress, dominating the temple. Because the temple, as I said, was the center of the spiritual, religious, cultural, political, economic life of Israel. So if you could control the temple and dominate the temple, you could dominate all of life there. And so King of Israel and Messiah are political titles. That's why Jesus had rejected the attempt to make him the king, and why Jesus told his disciples to say, not to say he was a Messiah. So when Jesus had been proclaimed the King of Israel as he went into Jerusalem, the religious and political leaders would have heard this. And so they would have thought Jesus is trying to lead an uprising to overthrow Roman rule. Because the only people who had the authority to appoint the king of Israel were the Romans. The Romans appointed Herod to be the king. When Herod died, the Romans appointed his sons to be kings as well. The Romans were the occupying power. They decided who was the king of Israel. They decided those things. So for the people to be proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, as the king of Israel, meant that he was trying to lead it. It was a threat to Roman authority and to Roman rule. And that was the problem. And the person who's responsible for maintaining order in the temple was the high priest. And the high priest wasn't a religious leader. He was a political appointee. The Romans appointed the high priest, and the high priest's job was to maintain order in Jerusalem, and also to report and hand over to the Romans anybody who was seen to be a political threat or a troublemaker. That was his job. And if he didn't go along with that, then they would replace him with somebody else. So Jesus then, he went into Jerusalem and he went into the temple, and he was drove the money changers from the temple. I think that was a huge mistake, because it caused a huge number of problems doing that. And it upset the religious leaders, the high priests, the chief priests, a lot. They felt he was not just threatening Roman rule, he was also threatening their authority as well. So as Jesus was teaching daily in the temple, the chief priests and scribes sought to destroy him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people hung upon his words. So the point is, even though they didn't like Jesus and what he was doing, they couldn't do anything because he was so popular and everybody surrounding him and supporting him. So then the chief priests and the elders gathered and took counsel to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. In other words, to arrest him secretly, not during the feast, lest there be a tumult among the people. So they realized if they try to arrest Jesus during the festival, there'll be riots and uprisings, because Jesus was so popular and so well supported. So they had to find a way of doing it secretly. So you might wonder why. Why were the high priest so much against, and chief priest so much against Jesus? It's really important to understand this, and it explains it here very clearly in the Bible. So this is at the meeting they had. They said, if we let him go on like this, in other words, if we allow Jesus to carry on teaching and preaching and working, everyone will believe in him. He was so well accepted. Jesus wasn't rejected by the Jewish people, he was accepted. And he was accepted by lots of them. Everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and destroy our holy place and our nation. So this for the priest was their main concern. If Jesus is so popular And if he tries to lead an uprising against the Roman authorities, the Roman soldiers are going to come out of the fortress and they're going to slaughter people, like they had done several times before. They slaughtered many messiahs and their followers. And the high priest was so concerned that Jesus is so much more popular than any of these other so-called messiahs before him, that as a result of that, the Romans might actually destroy the temple and destroy the country. And that was a real worry, because actually that happened 40 years later. 40 years after Jesus was killed, was executed, then there was an uprising of the Jewish people, and the Romans did lay siege to Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed, and 500,000 people were killed or sold into slavery. So Caiaphas then, difficult situation. What do you do? What do you do in this situation? So Caiaphas, he's the high priest. He says, it is better that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation should not perish. So Caiaphas, he's a high priest. He's got to make a decision. What's he going to do? So his decision is, he thinks, okay, if we kill Jesus, then his movement will disappear and the problem will be solved. We have a choice. Either we can kill Jesus or we can take the risk of the whole country, people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered and the temple destroyed. So when you think about it like this, you have to think, well, Caiaphas, he wasn't against Jesus. It's not that he didn't like Jesus or he rejected Jesus. It's just he's having to make a political calculation decision here. What are we going to do? And to be honest, if I was in that situation, I probably would have done the same thing. You've got to weigh up these things. One person dies or hundreds of thousands of people die. This is a kind of political calculation that people make. And, you know, when we look at the world in which we're living in today, our own political leaders, they have to make these kind of calculations to do with the coronavirus. What do you do? What do you do? Do you keep the economy open or do you lock it down? It's a big decision. You know, a lot of people, tens of thousands of people are going to die, whichever decision you make. That's the reality. So it's really difficult for people like Boris Johnson and presidents, prime ministers, having to make these decisions and not knowing all the information. Caiaphas didn't know all the information. He had to make a decision based upon the information he had. That's why it's so important to pray for political leaders as well, like Boris Johnson and the government, that they can have the wisdom to make the right decision. And the right decision isn't always the easy decision. Sometimes you have to make a really tough decision, which is a really unpopular decision, but you have to realize, make it based upon, this is the best thing for the country. Yeah. Whether one thinks they've made the right decision or not is something you'll see in hindsight. In hindsight, we can see Caiaphas made the wrong decision. But at the time, it looked like the right decision. Does that make sense? So whenever one makes a decision, one always has to think, okay, if I make this decision, it looks like the right decision to make now, but you have to try and work out, okay, what are the consequences going to be? Yeah, really important. So for example, now in Britain and other places, people are realizing the consequences of the economic lockdown are the economy is on the verge of collapsing. So, oh dear, we didn't think of that when we decided to have a lockdown to stop the virus from spreading. We didn't think about the economic consequences, but now people are finally recognizing that. So they're really difficult. It's really important to study. It's really important to think. It's really important to be able to, you know, figure out what are the consequences of the decision that I'm going to make. If you make one for your own life, you only affect your own life. If you're running a country and you make a bad decision, you affect the lives of millions of people. Does that make sense? Then these are really serious, you know, when one makes a decision that's going to affect the lives of others. Anyway, so this is, you know, the kind of person the high priest was. As an appointee of the Romans, He wasn't elected by the Jewish people. He wasn't a Jewish religious leader. As an appointee of the Romans, the high priest was not just a ceremonial official with control over the temple. He was, in effect, a chief of police with his own armed force, his own police tribunal and prisons for political offences. In the case of serious rebellion against the power of Rome, he would hand over the offender to the occupying Roman power. That was his responsibility. He had to go along with that and do that. So the problem was, for the high priest, they wanted to arrest Jesus, but they didn't know where he was. Okay, they didn't know where he was. So what was the real problem here? The real problem is that the high priest and the priest, they didn't know who Jesus was. And also they didn't know what Jesus taught. Now, as I explained this morning, if Jesus had grown up in the temple, he would have got to know Caiaphas personally. And so Caiaphas would have realized, oh, Jesus is a man with a plan. He's not trying to lead a violent uprising against the Romans. He's actually trying to find a peaceful resolution to this intense problem of the Roman occupation. So Caiaphas would have known that, and he would have realized that. But because Jesus was taken away by his parents and didn't grow up in the temple, then Caiaphas never had a chance to get to know Jesus. So who should have been able to explain to Caiaphas, Jesus is okay, you don't need to worry about him? The person who should have done that was John the Baptist. Because John the Baptist was the son of a priest. He grew up in the temple. He would have gone to the temple school. He would have known Caiaphas. He would have known all the chief priests and high priests. They would have been like his older uncles, yeah? And so if John the Baptist had followed Jesus and become Jesus' chief disciple, then John the Baptist could have gone to visit Caiaphas and said, hi, Uncle Caiaphas. I just want to tell you about Jesus. He's safe. You don't need to worry about him. He's not trying to lead an uprising against the Romans. He's not trying to overthrow the Romans. He's got a plan. This is his plan. This is his teaching. He wants to try and solve this problem peacefully, without violence. That makes sense? Then when Caiaphas realized that, Caiaphas would have thought, okay, I need to support Jesus and protect Jesus. Well, the problem was Caiaphas didn't know who Jesus was. He didn't know what Jesus was teaching, and he didn't have any way of contacting Jesus. So that was the problem. So the high priest was thinking, and the priests are thinking, well, we got to arrest Jesus, but we don't know who he is. Then you can imagine, well, maybe one of the priests said, oh, well, actually, I know one of Jesus' disciples. I went to school with him. Maybe I can see if I can set up a meeting. And so I think that's what happened here. I think this is one of the priests, I think, approached Judas Iscariot, and said, hi, Judas, we used to go to school together, remember? And I work for the high priest now. And the high priest would love to meet Jesus. The high priest would love to know what Jesus' plan is. He would love to hear what Jesus wants to do. And Judas would think, that's interesting. Maybe it would be good for Jesus to meet the high priest. Anyway, so Judas said, well, what will you give me if I set up a meeting? And okay, 30 pieces of silver. So Judas is acting as an intermediary. So nowadays in the world, if you want to meet an important politician, you need someone who's going to give you an introduction. And you have to pay that person to set up the meeting, to arrange a room, make the dinner, set up everything. So that's what Judas is doing. He's going to set up a meeting between Jesus and the high priest. So the question is then, well, what did Jesus know about this? Did Jesus know about this plan? So at the Last Supper, this is a picture here of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So Jesus, during the Last Supper, Jesus said to Judas, what you're about to do quickly. And that's really interesting. Jesus obviously knows what Judas is going to do. Now, if Jesus thinks Judas is going to betray me to the high priest and to the Romans, I'm going to get killed, Jesus would not have told Judas to go and do it, because Jesus didn't want to get killed. That wasn't the plan. So Jesus obviously knew about this meeting Judas was going to set up, because after Judas had this meeting with the priests, Then he went back and said to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, the high priest would like to meet you. Do you want me to set up the meeting?" And Jesus probably said yes. And so he's telling Judas to go and set up the meeting quickly. But what comes next? But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. In other words, none of the disciples understood what the arrangement was. They didn't know what Judas was trying to do. They didn't know what Jesus understood about what Judas was trying to do. So they just speculated that Judas was going to betray Jesus, because they didn't understand what was going on. So they speculated. They thought since Judas had charged the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival, to give something to the poor. They were ignorant about what the plan was that Jesus and Judas had, what they were trying to do anyway. So Judas goes away to do that. And then Jesus and the disciples, they go to Gethsemane and they pray in Gethsemane. And so Jesus realizes it's incredibly intense. He realizes the incredible intensity of the situation. It could go either way, depending upon how this meeting works out, whether he ends up getting arrested and put to death, or whether he can survive through the night and go away. So he prays desperately, so desperately his sweat became like great drops of blood. And he prays that things can work out in the right way. Anyway, so during that night, Judas comes to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests. So and Jesus says, "Am I leading a rebellion? That you come with swords and clubs?" So Jesus is surprised they've come to arrest him. It wasn't what he expected. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. So you can see here, this is Roman soldiers who've come to arrest Jesus. Yeah, there's some Jewish officials from the high priest, but basically it's a detachment of soldiers who've come to arrest Jesus. It's the Romans who are arresting Jesus. And then Jesus is taken to, the disciples all run away. Then Jesus is taken to the high priest's house. Peter denies him 3 times. There's an unfair trial by the high priest. It's unfair, it's at night. It's not a legal trial. It violates the laws of justice. It's not supposed to happen. It wasn't a proper procedure. There's no valid charge. There's no real evidence, and they try to frame him. And then he gets arrested. Then he's taken and delivered to Pilate, to the Roman authorities. So it's interesting to hear, to try and figure out what Judas thought about this. So it says here, when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with regret and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So from this, when we study this, we realize actually what happened to Jesus is not what Judas wanted to happen or what he expected to happen. Judas expected that Jesus was going to meet the high priest and have dinner with him and explain to him his ideas. When Judas realized what was happening, that actually Jesus had been arrested and was actually being tried by the high priest and condemned, he realized, oh my God, I made a huge mistake. Yeah, that's why he's seized with regret. What happened was not what he wanted to happen. Yeah, he wanted something very different to happen. So suddenly he realized, I have been tricked. I have been betrayed. Judas felt he had been betrayed and tricked, as he had. So that's why he went back to the chief priests and the priests and said, this wasn't the deal. The deal wasn't that that Jesus gets tried and condemned. The deal was that he can have a conversation and a discussion with the high priest. And the chief priests say, well, that's not our fault, that's your responsibility. So Judas then, he goes away and hangs himself. You might think, why did he hang himself? He realized he couldn't live with himself anymore. He realized because of what he'd done, then the Messiah, his Messiah, Jesus, was going to be killed, was going to be put to death. And he couldn't live with that anymore. He had such deep regret for what he'd done. He couldn't live with himself and he killed himself. A very sad situation of Judas. He did what he thought was the right thing, but it turned out to be a disaster, and he just couldn't live with that regret anymore. So Jesus then was brought in front of Pontius Pilate, who was the governor, and he was the governor there for 10 years during the time of Jesus' ministry. What kind of a person was he? He was well known to treat the Jews very disrespectfully and to ignore and treat their traditions disrespectfully. So we saw that this morning when he brought all the standards into Jerusalem and, almost caused a riot and problem. He was chastised by the emperor, the Roman emperor, several times for not governing in a more fair and just and orderly way. He stole money from the temple. He slaughtered the Samaritans. And after that, he was withdrawn. The Romans realized he's causing more trouble than solving problems. And so he was withdrawn from Rome and replaced by somebody else. This is the stone which was discovered in 1961, which mentions his name. So this is Philo of Alexandria. He was a contemporary of Jesus. He lived in Alexandria in Egypt, which is the largest Jewish settlement outside Israel. And he wrote about the history of his time, and he said Pilate's tenure, or Pilate's period of governorship, was associated with briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injustices, constantly repeated executions without trial, and ceaseless and grievous cruelty. So that's the kind of person that Pilate was. He was not a nice person. He's very, very, very harsh and ruled in a very unjust and unfair and unprincipled way. That's the kind of ruler he was, governor he was. Anyway, so Jesus then was brought in front of Pilate, and Pilate asked him a question: are you the king of the Jews? This isn't a question about beliefs, it's about, are you the king of the Jews? In other words, are you trying to lead a political uprising against the Roman authorities? Are you trying to overthrow the Romans and gain independence for Israel? It's a political question. Jesus said to him, you have said so. When he was accused by the chief priests, he made no answer, not even a single word. So he had this conversation with Pilate, and it's a political charge. And so Jesus was, it says in the Prince, Jesus was killed after being branded a rebel by the Roman Empire. And so when Jesus was executed, on his cross was put the title, the King of the Jews. So that's why Jesus was killed. So then you have this notorious thing you might have heard of. In the Gospels, the impression is given that Pilate didn't want to kill Jesus. That doesn't fit with the kind of character that Pilate was. It doesn't fit with the other descriptions we have of the kind of person that Pilate was. Pilate was quite happy to execute messiahs, but the Gospels present Pilate as not wanting to do that. And so you have this passage which you might have heard. So Pilate then is supposed to have offered a Jewish crowd the choice between releasing Jesus and a terrorist called Barabbas. So let's just go through this text. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather a riot was beginning because people were chanting they wanted him to release Barabbas and not Jesus, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children. So this is really important because people often know this passage. So when we looked at the life of Jesus this morning, we saw how incredibly well received he was by the people and by the religious leaders, apart from the chief priest. Okay? So what's going on here is this. First of all, there's no record of such events. In the gospel, it says it was customary for the governor to release a prisoner. Actually, there was no such custom. There's no record of this ever happening. This little episode you find in the Gospels is a fabrication. It's fake episode, which is created for a particular reason. Okay? There was no record of such a thing. So we see, though, what happened through this. Pilate washed his hands before the crowd, said, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and upon our children. The impression here, even if it did happen, it was only a small crowd of people in the early morning, but it says here the people as a whole. So it gives the impression that there's a referendum, that all the Jewish people were asked, do you want me to release Jesus? And the answer is all the Jewish people said no. Kill him and let his blood be on us and our children. So what's happened here? Through this, Pilate, Rome, and the empire were absolved of responsibility for the execution of Jesus. So through this thing of the washing their hands, it means the responsibility for the execution of Jesus is being transferred from Pilate and from Rome and from the Roman Empire onto the Jews. They were no longer responsible for executing Jesus. The responsibility for the execution of Jesus was now upon the Jewish people. So responsibility is transferred to the Jewish people as a whole and also onto all their descendants. So this then led to the creation of what's called a culture of contempt. So Christians then have treated Jews with contempt because they said, you rejected the Messiah. And so you should be punished for that. Not just you 2,000 years ago, but all your descendants as well. And so this has been a major justification for 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, culminating in the Holocaust not very long ago. And if you ask Christians about it, there are Christians who say, well, that's the punishment for killing Jesus. And so as a result of this, then, Christians haven't felt guilty for mistreating Jews over the last 2,000 years. So you might wonder, well, why? Why is that passage there? Why is it there? Well, Christians then, they were Jews who believed in Jesus, and they were witnessing in the Roman Empire. And they were being persecuted. And so in 70 AD, as I mentioned, the Jewish people revolted against the Roman occupation. They tried to overthrow the Romans, and the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. 500,000 Jews were either killed or sold into slavery. And so the Christian church then, they didn't want to be associated with the Jews. They didn't want Jesus to come across as a political subversive and rebel against the Roman authority. Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate as the king of the Jews. But Christians then, they didn't want the Romans to be blamed for executing Jesus, and so they wanted to transfer the blame for the execution of Jesus from the Romans onto the Jews. They could blame the Jews instead of blaming the Romans. And so then they accused the Jews of rejecting and murdering Jesus. But in reality, who was it that killed Jesus? This is a commentator upon what happened. In the accounts of Jesus' trial, one point stands out clearly. He was arrested as a rebel. That's why the Roman soldiers came to arrest him. He was accused before Pilate as being the king of the Jews. That's a political charge, nothing about some religious disagreement. He was found guilty as such. He was found guilty of being proclaimed or proclaiming himself the king of the Jews. And he was executed as the king of the Jews. None of the later additions, which in the Gospels overlay the original simple account, and none of the editorial changes from the hands of successive evangelists. An editorial change is something like that, Pilate washing his hands. That's an addition to the original account, to try to spin the account of why Jesus was killed in a different way. Can hide or disguise the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was arrested, accused, tried, sentenced, and executed on a charge of insurrection against Roman rule. That's the reality. He was accused and judged, executed, was trying to lead an uprising against the Roman occupation. Then Christianity spread, and they changed that little added those little verses in there to the Bible to transfer the blame from the Romans onto the Jews. And this is finally Christians only recently, just very recently, have started to recognize this and to take ownership for this. So this is a professor of the history of the church at the University of Oxford, Diamond McCulloch. He's often on television, and this is something he wrote in the newspaper last year, when the Church of England last year finally admitted that it wasn't the Jews who killed Jesus. So Christianity started as a heretical movement within Judaism. So all the early Christians are all Jews who believed in Jesus. And so the early church was regarded as a Jewish sect, just a sect, a particular denomination within Judaism, yeah, as Josephus described it, yeah. So Christianity started as a heretical movement within Judaism. So its 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contain unmistakable elements of hostility to what was then the Jewish establishment, because there's a lot of conflict between the Jews who believed in Jesus and the Jewish establishment. They're always arguing with each other, blaming and accusing each other. So these elements of hostility to the Jewish establishment, including shifting blame for Jesus' death, the Romans, to the Jewish authorities. So people recognize, Christian scholars recognize that's what went on. The gospel account of the life and death of Jesus was changed. By an accident of history, Christians gained an established status in the Roman Empire. Powerful Christianity could now use earlier rhetoric against the Jews to marginalize them. So when the Gospels are written, the Christian church was a tiny little group. There are many, many more Jews. Judaism was far larger in the Roman Empire than the early Christian church. The Christian church was a little sect. But it just so happened that Christianity grew, became accepted by the Roman Emperor Constantine, and then suddenly Christians had political power. And now that Christians had political power, they used that political power against the Jews, to marginalize the Jews. And so these verses we find in the New Testament then took on political power. So instead of just being an argument amongst Jews, between the Jews who believed in Jesus and the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, it now became an argument between Christians attacking Jews. And that carried on for 2,000 years. And that was basically behind what took place in the Holocaust. Anyway, so as I said, Jesus then was crucified. And when people came by, they derided him, they made fun of him, saying, "You destroy the temple, build it up in 3 days, save yourself." They made fun of him, he's alone. So what's interesting and really significant is what was Jesus' attitude on the cross. Things didn't turn out the way he expected. When he went into Jerusalem, if he thought that he was going to end up executed after a week, I don't think he would have gone into Jerusalem. I don't think he expected it to turn out the way it did. If he thought it was going to turn out like that, he would have said to his disciples, "Let's not go to Jerusalem this year. It's dangerous. Yeah, let's just wait, spend more time building up our foundation, building up our support, building up our contacts. We need to have more contacts with the high priest, for example. We need to, we look at Father's life. Father spent a lot of time doing this as well. Father didn't want to get killed. That's why Father spent a lot of time making contacts with political leaders, with religious leaders. Yeah, that's this whole thing with the ambassadors of peace. So that's like an umbrella to protect our movement and to protect our very small movement from getting persecuted and destroyed. But it worked out the way it worked out. So how did Jesus deal with that reality? Just like Father didn't want to go to prison, but he found himself in prison. So how do you deal with that? So on the cross then, Jesus established the foundation of faith and substance. So Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So it's not that Jesus lost faith in God, but quite the opposite. If you actually read this psalm, this is the first line of Psalm 22. This psalm describes someone who feels like they've been betrayed by God, they're going through hell, everything has gone completely and utterly wrong in their life, but they say, despite everything that's gone wrong, I still have faith in you. Okay, so when Jesus is saying this, he's quoting that psalm. He feels like the psalmist, that he's been betrayed and let down and feels abandoned. But despite that, he maintains his faith in God. Even if you've abandoned me, God, I will not abandon you. Yeah, that's what that means. And then he said to God, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So he loved his enemies. He had absolute faith in God and trust in God. No matter how things turned out, he didn't lose faith in God. And he loved his enemies. And then finally he said, into your hands I commit your spirit, my spirit. And then he went into hell, according to the Christian belief. He went to hell and woke up in hell. And when he's in hell, he started preaching to all the spirits in hell and liberating them. And so through Jesus preaching and to all the spirits in hell, then they were liberated. And so Satan decided he didn't want Jesus in hell anymore. And so he had the resurrection, and Jesus was resurrected. It says in the principle, in compensation for Satan's exercise of maximum power in killing Jesus, God exercised maximum power and resurrected Jesus. So the point is, Satan thought that by crucifying Jesus, Satan thought he had won. He thought he'd broken God's providence. And if Jesus had lost faith in God and said, God, this wasn't the deal, you let me down. If Jesus had cursed the people, you stupid people, I'm your Messiah, then there would have been no resurrection and Satan would have won. But because on the cross, Jesus had his unshakable faith in God and he loved and forgave his enemies, that is why Jesus was resurrected. Satan could not imagine how is it possible to have faith in God when everything turns out like that. Yeah, when all the promises and expectations you have look like they've been betrayed. Yeah, Satan at the fall felt a lack of love. It felt like God wasn't loving as much as he deserved, and he went off into this terrible tailspin. You got into a huff. Jesus didn't just feel a little lack of love, he felt completely abandoned, but he still maintained his faith and total dedication and trust in God. And he wouldn't abandon God or leave his position. Jesus kept his position as Son of God, which Lucifer couldn't do. He left his position, saw things from his own point of view. And so Satan couldn't accuse Jesus, because Jesus could do what Lucifer could not do. Satan could do what Jesus could do what Satan could not imagine it was possible to do. And that's why Satan could not accuse Jesus, and Satan just had to allow Jesus to be God, to resurrect Jesus. And then you had the resurrection. The tomb was found empty. Jesus' women who went there first to the tomb on Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. His body was missing. There were angels there who said he'd been resurrected. And then Jesus appeared to his disciples in a closed room. He appeared in a locked room. He also ate food. He also appeared to more than 500 disciples in one particular occasion. He appeared to 500 disciples. So it wasn't a hallucination. It was something very, very real, some kind of special body. His body disappeared. Something happened. Nobody knows how to explain it. Christians believe there was a physical resurrection. His physical body is resurrected, but there's something happened. There's something special. It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. There's something unusual. This is interesting, something called a shroud of Turin. This is a cloth, a burial shroud, which has been kept in Turin. I think it's now in Rome. And it was there for a long, long time. And the legend was that it was Jesus' burial cloth. But nobody knew. These little things here, where it happened to get burnt in a fire once, sometime in the Middle Ages. Anyway, when cameras came along, then someone took a photograph of it, and the negative of the photograph came out like this. And you can see very clearly here a man who's been crucified. This here is where the nails went into the wrist. Then there are blood stains down here. The nails went into the feet. There's blood stains here from where I'm not sure, maybe here, where the spear was put into his side. And there's blood stains here from the crown of thorns. And so it's believed that this is the burial shroud of Jesus. Nobody knows how this image was made. It's a mystery. It's not paint. It's not burnt on. Nobody knows. All it can say is it's there. And so the question is that these are the blood stains from the crown of thorns. And the question is this the image of Jesus? And this is something else. This is called a Sudarim of Ovida. You can see here, this is the cloth would have been put on Jesus' face when he was buried. The cloth was put over his face, and there's also marks here. And the blood group on this cloth is the same as the blood group on this cloth. And this cloth here can be traced all the way back to first century Palestine. They know who brought it from Palestine to a place in Spain. The Shroud of Turin, its history can be traced back to sometime in the Middle Ages. It's thought that during the time of the Crusades, it was brought to Italy for safety. But the cloth itself, when they analyzed this cloth, they found that the cloth itself has pollen from first century Palestine, and the way the cloth is folded is the way the cloth would have been folded in first century Palestine. So it's interesting. And then after the resurrection then, a few more minutes, give me. This is something very touching. So there's the resurrection then. But then that same day, this is the Sunday, the day of the resurrection, that same day, two of them, these are two of Jesus' disciples, were walking to the village of Emmaus, just outside Jerusalem, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem. They were deep in conversation, going over all these things that had happened. In the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along them, but they were not able to recognize who he was. He asked, "What's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" They just stood there, long-faced, like they'd lost their best friend, who they had. Then one of them, his name was Cleopas, or Peter, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what's happened the last few days?" They're so unhappy because it wasn't what they expected to happen. So Jesus said, "What's happened?" They said, "The things that happened to Jesus, the Nazarene from Nazareth. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in word, blessed by both God and all the people. So all the people accepted Jesus. Then our high priests and leaders betrayed him, got him sentenced to death, and crucified him. And we had our hopes up that he was the one about to deliver Israel. And it is now the third day since it happened. But now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning, they were at the tomb and they couldn't find his body. They came back with the story that they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it was empty, just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus." Then he said to them, "So thick-headed, so slow-hearted. Why can't you, I can't see what it says here. Why can't you believe all that the prophets have said? Don't you see that these things had to happen? That the Messiah had to suffer and only then enter into his glory?" Then he started at the beginning with the books of Moses and went through all the prophets, pointing out everything in the scriptures that referred to him. They came to the edge of the village where they were headed. He acted as if he was going on, but they pressed him, "Stay and have supper with us. It's nearly evening, the day is done." So he went in with them, and here's what happened. He sat down at the table with them. Taking the bread, he blessed and broke it and gave it to them. At that moment, open-eyed, wide-eyed, they recognized him, and then he disappeared. Back and forth they talked. Didn't we feel on fire as he conversed with us on the road as he opened up the scriptures for us. Yeah. And so you might wonder, why do Christians believe that Jesus was supposed to die and be crucified? The reason is because Jesus said that to them. He told them that. What Jesus did is he reframed his life. Even though it didn't turn out the way he expected it to turn out, he embraced what happened as God's will. And I remember when Father went to prison in Danbury in America in, I think, 1984, I remember we were fighting and praying that he shouldn't go to prison. There was a court case, fighting through the courts to prevent him from going to prison on this basically trumped up charge. But he went. But the day before he went to prison, he said, it's God's will that I should go to prison. And because I'm going to prison, all kinds of good things are going to happen in America, and Christians are going to come and follow us. And I found that so shocking. We thought, no, you're wrong. You're not supposed to go to prison. But Father, actually wasn't the plan, but that's what happened. So Father embraced it as God's will. And he turned a defeat into a victory. And that's what messiahs do. They turn defeats into victories. If something goes wrong, they find a way to embrace the situation and to transform it into something which is good. And so that's what Jesus did, following the example set by Jacob when he was treated by Laban, mistreated by Laban. And that's what Joseph did when he, I think I told you last Easter, or the Easter before that, I can't remember which workshop it was, when he also reframed his life. Yeah. And something we each need to think about ourselves, look back on our life and realize, okay, it was a disaster, but actually from that disaster, I've been able to learn something and something good has come out of it. So in many ways, as a country, we're going through a disaster. Okay, all right, this is what's happened, this is what's going on. How can we turn this around to get something good out of this? Yeah, that's what Jesus is doing here. And he restored his disciples and sent the Holy Spirit after the resurrection and the ascension into the spiritual world. The Holy Spirit, Jesus and the Holy Spirit became the true parents, bringing spiritual rebirth to enter a realm where Satan cannot invade. And this is what Jesus says in the beginning of the Gospel of John. But to all who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. They can see here this is the change of identity. By believing in Jesus and being born again through Jesus and the Holy Spirit, one can become a change of identity and you can become the children of God. Yes, feel like I'm the son or the daughter of God. What happened after that was, as I mentioned, this first Jewish revolt against the Roman rule. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, all the gold from the temple is taken to Rome, still commemorated there. You can see it till this day. And the gold from the temple in Rome was used to build the Colosseum. And in the Colosseum, that's where the gladiators fought, and that's where Christians were fed to lions. The money to build the Colosseum came from the temple in Jerusalem. And there's another revolt, which is a disaster. So I'm not going to go into this. Okay. Well, this is just the final conclusion. If Jesus had been rejected by sometimes people say that the Jews rejected Jesus. The reality is, if Jesus had been rejected by his Jewish contemporaries, he would have faded into obscurity. He's some kind of nutcase standing on the street corner, or like a nutcase standing in Hyde Park, shouting to people about the kingdom of heaven. And people would just have made fun of him. They would have ignored him. If Jesus had been rejected, we wouldn't know who he was. The reason why he was killed was because he was so well received that he was perceived to be a threat to the establishment. And so he was executed by the Romans on a political charge. He was so well received by the Jewish people and by religious leaders that he was seen to be a threat by the political establishment, by the Roman authorities. So I think if things had gone differently, he would have mediated a peaceful resolution of the relationship and he would have fulfilled the messianic task. If things had worked out differently, the Romans would have realized, actually, he's the only one who can sort out these rebellious Jewish people and establish peace. And I think the Romans then, as the occupying power, they would have appointed Jesus to become the King of the Jews. And from there, he could have gone to Rome and to other places and to bring about world peace.